Hey, good evening. Welcome to Spring Creek, to our Bible study, Wednesday night Bible study. And I want to encourage you before I forget, once this quarantine is over, we'll be back to our hopefully regular schedule, regular times at church. And we have this Bible study every Wednesday night at 6:30. So we want to invite you to come be with us in person. But we're going to continue in Daniel. And it's nice, isn't it, to be able to take a break from coronavirus talk and press conferences and just the gloom of being isolated and just focus on God's Word for just a little bit. So for the next 30-40 minutes, we're going to talk about Daniel and specifically Daniel chapter 5. Let me just remind you of where we started in Daniel chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar, after a series of wars, goes back to Babylon through Jerusalem, and he picks up Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and several young, really well-to-do, very promising Hebrew children, takes them back to Babylon. And then Daniel is kind of being raised in the palace, learning all the Babylonian culture and different things. Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that wise men and sorcerers couldn't interpret. Daniel does, and it's a dream about a statue. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold, followed by the silver of the Medo-Persians, the bronze of the Greeks, and then the iron and clay of the Roman Empire. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and Daniel interprets it. Chapter 3, immediately after the dream, Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue. He has this bout of hubris and pride and decides that he's just going to build the thing. So he builds it, and not, I guess, heeding the warning that in the vision, a stone that was not cut with hands flies out of a mountain and crushes the statue and destroys it. So he builds this thing in chapter 3, and he orders on pretense of worship, and it's a preview, I think, of the Antichrist. On pretense of peace, he gets all the people out for a dedication. Turns into worship. He wants them to worship him, basically, through the statue. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego decide to decline his invitation. They don't bow. He gives them a second chance. And that's the fiery furnace story in chapter 3, where they're thrown in. They survive because Jesus is with them, and the soldiers that threw them in are killed. So that's chapter 3. Now chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar suffers the wrath of God, and Daniel tells him that for 7 years, basically, he has another dream, and Daniel says for 7 years, basically you're going to be like a wild animal. And so it comes to fruition. Nebuchadnezzar lived 7 years in the woods. His skin, the Bible describes like eagle feathers, his claws, and he lives out in the woods for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, he gives some praise to the Lord, a 7-part praise, and so that's how chapter 4 ends. Now chapter 5 ends with Nebuchadnezzar basically being dead. He dies in 526 BC, or 562 BC, I'm sorry. So let me tell you real quick how chapter 5 sets up. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562 BC, and he has a son named Ewil-Marduk, and Ewil-Marduk takes over, and he rules from 562 BC for 2 years to 560 BC. If you want to read about him, you can look in Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 31, and it'll kind of briefly describe him. Not much to him. He only reigned for 2 years, but that's who followed Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Ewil-Marduk, the reason his reign ended in 2 years is he was murdered by his brother-in-law. Again, you can read about this in Jeremiah chapter 39, verse 3. His brother-in-law is a guy by the name of Nergal-Sarezer, and he kills Ewil-Marduk, and he takes over. When Nergal-Sarezer takes over, he is then killed by a fellow named Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus takes over and marries Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. They have a son. His son is named Belshazzar. And so Belshazzar is the character in Daniel chapter 5. It's Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. So he takes over now, and he's going to, chapter 5 sets up with a party. So let me read to you just a couple of verses, and then we'll kind of, I'll tell you the background of the party. Belshazzar, in chapter 5, verse 1, Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So here's how this is kind of playing out. It's the year 539 BC, and again, Babylon is at war. They're at war, and they're against the Medo-Persian Empire, basically being led by the Medes. And there's a general on the Medo-Persian side by the name of Gabryas. And Gabryas does a really clever thing, and he detours or diverts one of the canals of the Euphrates River from the palace. And by doing that, he kind of, in effect, makes a tunnel under the walls. And so his soldiers are besieging the city by wallowing out this tunnel under the wall by diverting the water, and they're going to lay siege to the city. Now, it's at this time that chapter 5 takes place. They're at war, and Belshazzar does something that may not seem real logical. And honestly, I don't know why he does it, but he throws a party. And the party may be a morale booster. I mean, the country's at war. Maybe he thinks that they need a little shot of encouragement or something. I don't know, but the guy throws a party. Now, look at what it says in the first verse. He throws a party for 1,000 of his nobles, and he's drinking wine. Look at verse 2. When Belshazzar tasted the wine. The word tasted, when you read tasted in the Aramaic, it means that he's beginning to feel the effects of the wine. So not only is he drinking the wine with all these 1,000 at this great party, but he's starting to get a little buzz from the effects of the wine. He's starting to feel it just a little bit. And because his faculties are diminishing, he's going to do something that it's actually outright blasphemous. For him, it's not. He doesn't care. But look what it says that he does. He orders in verse 2. He orders the stewards to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his granddaddy Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple. And it says his father, it's actually his grandfather. It's the same terminology. They had taken it out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. In other words, the temple since Solomon's time had been collecting gold and silver implements for the temple. Drinkware, plates, goblets, those kind of things. Let me read to you in 1 Kings chapter 10, and this is kind of where it starts. 1 Kings chapter 10, starting in verse 14, and I want you to listen to this. Now the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Besides that, from the traders and the wares of the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country, King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each large shield. In other words, when the gold started coming into the temple, and this will make sense to you in just a minute, when it started coming into the temple, in 1 year, they took in 83,255 pounds of gold. And so the temple has all this gold. And it's not just gold bars, but it's in the form of plates and cups and goblets and those kind of things. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 14, some of those temple wares begin to be lost or stolen, and they start to be replaced. If you look at 2 Kings chapter 16, they use a lot of this, what is in essence the treasury. They use it to bribe the Assyrians out of a war. If you look at Isaiah chapter 39, Hezekiah showed the treasure to the Babylonians. And so now who's got it? The Babylonians. And so Belshazzar is throwing this feast for whatever reason. Maybe it's for morale, but he's throwing this feast, and he orders his people to go out and get the temple silverware. And look at what it says in verse 3 and 4. They brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, irons, wood, and stone. This is a drunken feast, and this is extremely blasphemous. He's taken the temple furnishings, and he's not only drinking wine and alcohol to the excess, but he's also using them in a celebration for the gods of this world, for the Babylonian pantheon. And so if you're Daniel, or if you're a correctly thinking person, you got to know God's not going to be happy with this. So look at verse 5, because verse 5 is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw, and this is important, the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Follow the story. Belshazzar is throwing a drunken feast. He's inebriated from the wine. He calls out for the temple furnishing. He starts drinking out of the temple instruments. And then all of a sudden he looks up, and on the wall beside the lampstand, and it's beside the lampstand, so I guess the wall is going to become transparent. And so on this wall that Belshazzar is looking at, all of a sudden it says, look at the way this is worded, he sees the fingers of a man's hand emerge. And so when you think about this, and you can look at the wall in front of you, if you're facing a wall right now, and imagine the wall becomes translucent or transparent, and imagine that you're looking at this wall, and you see fingers start to come out at you, and the fingers are coming at you. And look what it says. He saw the back of the hand. So you read that and you think, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because he sees the fingers coming out first, then he sees the back of the hand. Back in Aramaic means palm. So he sees the hands that are, the fingers that are coming out, and he sees the palm. And so what's going to happen now is, as he is in this drunken feast with all of his nobles, he sees the hand of God come through a translucent or transparent wall. The fingers come out first. He sees the palm, and almost as if it's from the inside of the wall, the hand begins to write something. And so Belshazzar is sitting there watching this, and this hand starts writing. Now look at verse 6, because verse 6 tells you 4 things that happened. And to be honest with you, it's not funny, but it could be, because every one of us would react the same way. And I'm going to tell you something about how we do react the same way. But look at verse 6. Then the king's face grew pale. That's number 1. In other words, he turned white as a sheet. Look at the second thing. His thoughts alarmed him. He started, what do we say? His conscience started acting up. Look what happened next. His hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. I mean, it's describing a man that's absolutely terrified. He sees the hand of God come through the wall. It starts to write something, and immediately he gets terrified. He turns white as a sheet. His thoughts start running through his mind. Everything he has done wrong. What he's being, what's he going to be punished for? How far is God going to take this? Because you can't tell me that he hadn't heard stories about his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar that had to live 7 years out in the woods like an animal. And so he's beginning to be upset about this. And then his hip joints and his knees don't work, and he can't stand. Now, let me tell you how this works. In other words, this is a guy, and this is the point that I'm praying that you're not in. And I'm praying we never get into this point. But here's a guy that's openly mocking God, drinking to excess out of the temple furnishings, openly mocking God, and now God's doing something about it. It's one thing for us to mock God. It's one thing for us to say, God, I don't care. I'm going to do things my way. I read the Bible and I see what you tell me to do and I see what you tell me to stay away from, but I really don't care. I'm going to do it my way, no matter what. No, you know. But then it's another thing when the consequences start to emerge. Husbands are big talk when their wives are not around. But when the wives hear about what they said, it's a different story. The apologies start coming, the nervousness starts adding up, and you start kind of calculating the cost in your head. That's what's happening to Belshazzar. So let me tell you what this means for me and you. Our conscience makes cowards out of all of us. Because we can think that we've got it all under control. We can think that we've got it all mastered. We can think that we're just absolutely fearless in what we're doing. But when your conscience starts pointing out your flaws and pointing out your inadequacies, it's a whole different story. But let me tell you something. When our inadequacies meet the sufficiency of God, miracles take place. So it's okay sometimes to feel inadequate, but not like this. Not because we're openly mocking the God of heaven. And so he's mocking, he's doing his thing, and this hand comes out. Now look at verse 6. Then the king's face grew pale. In other words, it got whiter. All right, and his thought, verse 7. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon. Again, he calls in, just like his forefathers, he's called in all these magicians. Any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. In other words, he's setting up a triumvirate rule. He said, if anybody wants if anybody can tell me what this means, what this is all about, interpret this handwriting, then we're going to turn this into a triumvirate rule, a three-party rule, and you guys get to be the third ruler. Look at verse 8. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not. Isn't that a big surprise? Nowhere in Scripture, when these kings, these pagan kings, called in their wise men, nowhere in Scripture do they have the right answer. All the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, got even whiter, and his nobles were perplexed. Everybody's upset because the king is so upset that they don't know what to do. Daniel has apparently been forgotten because who's the first person Nebuchadnezzar called? Daniel. He had a place in the king's kind of inner circle. Evidently with Belshazzar and the ones that came after Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel lost that status. So he's kind of been forgotten. He doesn't have a place in this kingdom. But look at verse 10. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. Evidently, this queen is his mother because of the way she's acting. She does. In verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, actually his grandfather, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. So evidently, this queen, probably Belshazzar's mother, comes in and says, "Don't be so upset. Don't get pale. Don't let your knees knock. Don't let everything bother you, because there's a guy in the kingdom that can help you. I know because your grandfather used him, and he was so good at what he did. He understood the dreams and the interpretation, and your grandfather promoted him as the chief over all these guys that you're calling on now. So let's remember him. Now look at verse 12, because verse 12 is something that every one of us should strive for. Look at verse 12. This was because this, talking about remembering Daniel and saying this about Daniel, this was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas or mysteries, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he'll declare the interpretation. That's a wonderful commentary on Daniel. I mean, think about what they're saying about Daniel. They're saying about Daniel, listen, there's a great spirit on him. I mean, God's hand is on this guy. He knows he can do things that nobody else can do. Not because of who he is, but because of the God that's working through him is what it turns out to be. All right, so verse 13, and let's watch how this thing progresses. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" All right, now look at verse 13, because this is amazement in the king's voice. Because look what he has. There's a couple of things about verse 13. The first thing is he's amazed that Daniel's still here, because Daniel's in his 80s at this point. And he says, "Are you that same Daniel? Are you the Daniel?" And look how he describes you, because it's important. Look at verse 13. "Are you that Daniel who's one of the exiles from Judah?" Daniel has been in Babylon for 65 years. And they still refer to him as an exile. That's wonderful. That's fantastic. You and I ought to feel the same way here. We're not, I mean, technically we're citizens of the United States, but our home is in heaven. We're just passing through here. We can't get too attached here. And he's going to talk about that here in just 1 minute. But that's really good, and that's one of the things that Hebrew chapter 11 talks about. That you don't get too comfortable here. Matter of fact, let me read to you Revelation chapter 3 verse 10, and let's see how it kind of describes this. This is to the church at Philadelphia. Verse 10. "Because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I also will keep you from the hour of testing. That hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those," watch this, "who dwell on the earth." Dwell means to have your feet planted deep in the earth. To really put down stakes here. That's not how we're supposed to live. We're not supposed to live like this world is it. Like everything ought to be invested here. Like all of our hopes are here, all of our dreams are here, all of our finances are here, all of our material things. That we're not supposed to live like this world is everything, because our feet are not really driven down and planted into this earth. We're primarily citizens of another place, another kingdom. Citizen of heaven. But look what it says about Daniel. This is fantastic. After 65 years in Babylon, 65 years. He says, "Are you one of those exiles that my granddaddy brought here? You don't really belong here. You're not one of us. Are you one of those outcast guys?" Now look at verse 14. This is just like a king that don't know anything. Look at verse 14. "Now I have heard about you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you." He repeats exactly what his mama says, but acts like he knew it all along. All right, that's typical bureaucrat. All right, get verse 15. "Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, and that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you're able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you'll be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you'll have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." He repeats the reward. He repeats it. The wise men can't do it. They've already bowed out. And so he says to Daniel, because I'm not really sure if he believes he can do it or not, but he says, if you can do this, he says, I'll do a couple of things for you. I'm going to clothe you in rich purple. And this is what they call royal purple. It is a purple dye that comes from, and I'm trying to say this as tactfully as I can, but it comes from a certain snail that lives on the seacoast, and they took the little snail and they popped it, and this little purple dye came out of these little snails. It took about 60,000 snails to make an ounce of this purple, and so they took this and they dyed it into the cloth of kings. And so the kings would dress in purple, and all the dignitaries, says they're the only ones that could afford it. So he says to Daniel, if you can do this for me, I'm going to dress you in royal purple. And he says, I'm going to give you great treasures, including a necklace of gold. Why is that important? Write this down and go back and read Genesis chapter 41, verse 42. Gold in the ancient times was a symbol of authority. And so he says, if you can do this for me, I'm going to give you this royal purple robe. I'm going to give you this gold necklace, which symbolizes your authority, and I'm going to make you the third in a triumvirate rule of Babylon. You're going to be one of the three rulers, so that all the satraps and all the governors and all the prefects, they're all going to report to you. Be one of the three main guys. All right, now look at verse 17 now. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, forgive your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. This is a classic comment on Belshazzar, because he thought that what he was offered was the greatest gift imaginable. And Daniel turns him down. Daniel says, I really don't need this. Daniel says, I'm going to interpret the dream anyway. Look at verse 18. O King, the Most High God, granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive. And whomever he wished he elevated, whomever he wished be humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of the beast, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they brought the vessels of his house before you, and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you've praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, they don't hear, nor do they understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath, and all your ways you have not glorified. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. So he gives him a recap. He says, you knew all this about your granddaddy. God blessed him, but he got too arrogant. So God humbled him. And then because of his testimony at the end, all people started praising God. He said, but you forgot this. You have forgotten the lesson from your grandfather. You've forgotten what God does to the arrogant and what God does to the humble. You just forgotten it. He says, so I'm going to interpret this dream for you. And he said, this hand was sent from him, from God, and this is the inscription. Look at verse 25 and look at the inscription. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upsharon. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. So Daniel interprets it, and he gives him basically three things. He says, Mene, God has numbered your days. You're not going to believe how many days he has left. But God says, I've numbered your days. And then he says, tekel, and he's talking about a scale. In ancient days, you probably have heard this, in ancient days, the belief was that in the afterlife, scales were associated with judgment. For example, in Egypt theology, they believed that when you died and crossed over, that the gods would take your heart out and weigh it on a scale, and see if your heart had enough weight to get you through the afterlife or not. And so he's basically saying God is going to judge you. That's what he's referring to. God has numbered your days. You're under the judgment of God. And then Perez, he says, your kingdom has been divided. It's been taken apart. And it's going to be given over to the Medes and Persians. In other words, this gold head of Nebuchadnezzar is coming to an end. And now we're moving into the second phase of the statue, which is the silver part of the Medo-Persians. All right, so he goes in and gives Daniel the reward. Daniel's not asking for it, but Belshazzar seems to be, I guess, a man of his word. So he gives him the royal purple, he gives him the necklace, and he makes him a triumvirate ruler of Babylon. But look at verse 30. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So he got taken out that very same night. So it's a short-lived promotion for Daniel. Daniel gets promoted, gets all this stuff, and then that same night, the guy that promoted him gets killed. And look what happens. So Darius, the Mede, the next guy that's going to be the first in the Medo-Persian kingdom, received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So Daniel's going to be in his 80s. The new king is going to be in his 60s. As a matter of fact, I've told our church before that in the original manuscripts, there's no chapter divisions and there's no verse division. Those are man-made in the 13th and 15th century. So chapter 5, verse 30, or verse 31, actually serves as the first verse to chapter 6. Because chapter 6 is now going to talk about how this new king of Babylon, who's a Medo-Persian, is going to talk about how he now forms a relationship with Daniel that's in his 80s and he's been there for 65 years, and how they form a relationship together. And the nobility doesn't like it, and so they're going to go after Daniel. And so that's where chapter 5 ends. It reminds us about our arrogance. It reminds us about the fact that God exalts the humble, but he brings down the prideful. And so if you want to go back and read chapter 5, it's a great chapter. You can really study it. But go ahead and look through chapter 6 for next week, because you know the story. It's Daniel in the lion's den. And hopefully next week I'm going to bring out some things in the story that you may have never thought about before, considered before, about this particular story. But it begins in verse 31 of chapter 5. Darius is now king. We don't know a whole lot about Darius. I'm going to tell you about that next week. But he becomes king, starts this Medo-Persian Empire, and he gets to be friends with Daniel. And then the people are after Daniel, and so they basically set up their king to go after Daniel. So read that, and remember that all this judgment of God, we tend to think about it sometimes, and we think that's not fair, that's too drastic, that's too harsh. But God continues to give us chances. God's not just a vindictive ruler that's sitting in heaven like Zeus was depicted with a lightning bolt ready to strike us down. God is a God of compassion and mercy, but he's also a God of judgment. And we can't exhaust our chances. We can't just keep on going to the well over and over again. God's going to be merciful to us, but that mercy runs out at a certain point, and we don't get extended another chance. So maybe you're out there, and maybe you need to just pray tonight and say, God, I've been a little too prideful. I've just been a little too full of myself. God, I need for you to help me be humbled. I need to turn to you, and I need to make sure that I'm following you in your path for my life. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. Share the video if you'd like. Join us next week. It looks like for the next several weeks at least, we're going to be live streaming only and not in person. But I do want to invite you to Spring Creek Sunday morning. Sunday morning at 10:15, we're going to have a drive-up Easter service. And we'll have people out there parking your cars, and we're going to try to get it through your radios. Shipping is a little bit behind now because of the virus, and so it's taken us a little while to get our equipment in that we need to do this. Hopefully it's going to come. Pray for that. If not, we'll roll our windows down a little bit and we'll pump up the volume and you can hear it. But we're going to follow all the safety precautions and social distancing. Nobody's going to be able to get out of their cars. And I do want to remind you of this. We will not be able to open the church for restroom facilities. So with that being said, I'm going to try to preach a fairly quick sermon for you. I don't keep you there all day, but make sure you get the little ones to go before they leave the house, and everything should be okay. But we will not be able to open the doors and let people into the facility. So be there at 10:15. We'll get started and we'll get you out there as soon as possible. But it's a good chance for some of us who haven't been together on Sundays in a while. We can't hug, we can't shake hands, unfortunately, but we can wave at each other through the window and we can all be together on Easter Sunday. So Easter Sunday, this Sunday morning at 10:15 at Spring Creek Baptist Church. Share that information with people that you know. It would be nice if everybody watching this video tonight would invite one person that don't go to church or don't belong to Spring Creek, doesn't have anywhere to go Sunday. Invite one person to come with you. You can't go pick them up. They got to provide their own transportation there, because of the social distancing, but you can make the invite. Thank you for being with us. God bless you. Talk to y'all Sunday morning.